After my husband's funeral, my son stopped the car on highway and said, "Get out." The rain hadn't stopped since Tuesday. 4 days of relentless Georgia downpour that turned our gravel driveway into a muddy mess and made the whole world feel like it was drowning right along with me. Standing at Calvin's graveside, clutching a wilted carnation that was supposed to represent 33 years of marriage, I wondered if the sky was crying because I couldn't seem to. Everyone kept telling me how well I was holding up, how strong I was being. Pastor Williams squeezed my shoulder and whispered something about God's plan that I didn't really hear. The ladies from church hovered around me like protective hens, their black umbrellas creating a fortress of sympathy that felt more suffocating than comforting. But the truth was I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the 3 months of watching cancer eat away at the man I'd loved since I was 19 years old. Maybe it was the morphine haze that had filled our house for weeks, turning my husband into a stranger who spoke in whispers and slept 20 hours a day. By the time Calvin took his last breath, I'd already been grieving for months. "Mom." Malcolm's voice cut through the rain and the murmured condolences. My son stood at my elbow, tall and solid in his black suit, looking more like his father than ever. At 31, he had Calvin's strong jaw and those same deep-set brown eyes that used to sparkle with mischief. But lately, those eyes had grown cold and distant. "It's time to go," he said, not quite meeting my gaze. I nodded and let him guide me away from the crowd, away from the hole in the ground that would be Calvin's new address. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else as we walked across the soggy cemetery grass toward his truck. Behind us, I could hear the scrape of shovels beginning their final work. The drive home should have been quiet and respectful. It should have been a time for Malcolm and me to comfort each other, to share memories of the man we'd both lost. Instead, my son gripped the steering wheel like he was trying to strangle it, his knuckles white against the black leather. "You okay, baby?" I asked, using the nickname that had embarrassed him since he turned 16. He didn't answer, just kept staring straight ahead at the rain-slicked highway that led back to our farmhouse. Our home. The place Calvin and I had bought when Malcolm was just 2 years old, back when we thought we'd have more children and fill all those empty bedrooms with laughter. The house came into view after 20 minutes of uncomfortable silence. It sat on 15 acres of rolling hills, white clapboard siding and green shutters that Calvin had repainted just last spring. The wraparound porch where we'd spent countless evenings drinking sweet tea and watching Malcolm chase fireflies. The old oak tree with a tire swing that 3 generations of children had used. The vegetable garden that Calvin tended with the same careful attention he gave everything else in his life. Home. The word should have brought comfort, but something felt wrong. Malcolm pulled into the driveway and stopped the engine, but he didn't get out. He just sat there, rain drumming on the roof, his breathing heavy and labored like he'd been running. "Malcolm." I reached over to touch his arm, but he pulled away. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat and strange. "Of course, honey. Let's go inside." And
"No."
The word came out sharp, final. "Not in there." My stomach clenched. Something was very wrong. In all the chaos of Calvin's illness and death, I'd noticed Malcolm growing more distant, more angry. But I'd chalked it up to grief. Men process loss differently, I told myself. He was just protecting himself, the only way he knew how. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm finally turned to look at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold. This wasn't grief. This wasn't the face of a son mourning his father. This was something else entirely. Something calculating and cruel. "The house isn't yours anymore," he said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "What?" "Dad left everything to me. The house, the business, the land. All of it." His voice was steady now, almost businesslike. "You need to get out." The world tilted sideways. I pressed my palm against the cool window, trying to anchor myself to something real. "Malcolm, that's not possible. Your father and I, we built this life together. That house isn't yours." He reached across me and opened the passenger door. Cold air and rain rushed in, soaking my funeral dress. "Get out. You can't be serious." But even as I said it, I could see that he was dead serious. "Malcolm, I'm your mother. I raised you in that house. I sacrificed everything. Get out." The roar came from somewhere deep in his chest, primal and furious. For a moment, he looked like a stranger. Not my sweet little boy who used to crawl into bed with Calvin and me during thunderstorms. Not the teenager who brought me flowers on Mother's Day even when his friends teased him. This was someone else entirely. My hands shook as I fumbled for my purse, my small overnight bag from the funeral home. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not after burying my husband just an hour ago. "Malcolm, please." I tried one more time, standing in the rain beside his truck. "Let's talk about this inside. We're both grieving. We're not thinking clearly." But he was already backing out of the driveway, spraying gravel and mud, leaving me standing there in my black dress and sensible funeral shoes with nowhere to go. I watched his taillights disappear around the bend, their red glow swallowed by the gray afternoon. The rain soaked through my clothes within minutes, but I couldn't move, couldn't process what had just happened. 33 years of marriage, 31 years of raising that boy. And this was how it ended? Standing in a muddy driveway in my funeral clothes, abandoned by the only family I had left? The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd buried my husband this morning, and now I was losing my home and my son in the same day. If I wasn't already numb from grief, this might have broken me completely. But something deep inside my chest began to burn. Not sadness, not shock, anger. Because I knew Calvin. I knew that man better than I knew myself after all these years. And the Calvin I'd loved, the Calvin I'd nursed through his final months, would never have left me with nothing. Never would have thrown me out into the cold without a thought for my future. Which meant either my son was lying, or there was something about my husband's final wishes that I didn't understand yet. Either way, I wasn't going down without a fight. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and called the only person I could think of. My sister Lorna answered on the second ring. "Maggie, how did the service go?" "I need help," I said, my voice breaking for the first time that day. "I need somewhere to stay." Because whatever game Malcolm thought he was playing, he just made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated his mother. The 20-minute wait for Lorna felt like 20 hours. I stood under the mailbox at the end of our driveway. My driveway, I kept telling myself, watching every car that passed, hoping it wasn't Malcolm coming back to finish whatever cruel game he'd started. My funeral dress clung to my skin, heavy with rain and disbelief. When Lorna's beat-up Honda finally appeared through the gray curtain of rain, I nearly collapsed with relief. She jumped out before the car fully stopped, her face a mask of worry and confusion. "Jesus, Maggie, what happened to you?" She wrapped me in her arms, and for the first time since Calvin's diagnosis, I let myself cry. Real tears, not the polite dampness I'd managed at the graveside. These were ugly, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere I'd kept locked away for months. He threw me out. I gasped between sobs. Malcolm threw me out of my own house. Lorna held me tighter, her own voice shaking. "That's impossible. There has to be some mistake." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. Lorna had always been the practical one, the sister who planned for every possible disaster. She'd never liked Malcolm's attitude during Calvin's illness, though she'd kept her mouth shut out of respect for my grief. The drive to Lorna's apartment in town passed in a blur of streetlights and my sister's worried glances in the rearview mirror. She lived in a modest two-bedroom place above the bakery where she worked, the kind of temporary housing that had somehow become permanent over the years since her divorce. "You can stay as long as you need," she said, helping me up the narrow stairs. "But Maggie, we need to figure out what's really going on here." I spent that first night on her couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying every conversation I'd had with Calvin in his final weeks. Had he said something about changing his will? Had there been signs I'd missed while I was focused on his medications and doctor appointments? By morning, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Malcolm was grieving. He was angry at the world for taking his father. He'd said things he didn't mean, and once he came to his senses, we'd work it out like a family should. I called him 6 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. This is ridiculous, I told Lorna over coffee. I'm going home. Maybe you should wait. It's my house, Lorna. I've been cleaning those floors and tending that garden for 30 years. I'm not going to be scared away by my own son having a breakdown. The cab ride back to the farmhouse cost me $40 I couldn't really afford, but I needed to face this head-on. I needed to walk through my front door, sit Malcolm down at the kitchen table where I'd fed him countless meals, and have a real conversation about whatever was eating him alive. But when I reached for the front door handle, it wouldn't turn. The locks had been changed. I stood there for a full minute, turning the handle again and again, like maybe I was doing it wrong. Like maybe 30 years of muscle memory had suddenly failed me. But no, these were different locks entirely. Shiny new deadbolts that my house key couldn't even begin to touch. I walked around to the back door, the one that led into the mudroom where Calvin hung his work boots. New locks there too. Even the basement entrance had been secured with hardware I'd never seen before. My own house had been locked against me like I was some kind of criminal. I called Malcolm from the porch swing where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby. This time, he answered. What do you want? I want to come home, Malcolm. I want to understand what's happening here. I told you yesterday, the house isn't yours anymore. That's impossible. My voice cracked, but I pushed on. Your father and I were married for 33 years. Georgia is a marital property state. Even if he did leave you something in his will. He left me everything. Malcolm's voice was flat, emotionless. The house, the business, the savings accounts, the life insurance. Everything. I don't believe you. Then call James Morrison, Dad's lawyer. He'll tell you the same thing. The line went dead. James Morrison had been Calvin's attorney for 15 years. He'd handled the business contracts, our simple wills, even the deed when we'd refinanced the house back in 2018. If anyone would know the truth about Calvin's final wishes, it would be James. His secretary squeezed me in that afternoon, probably because she'd heard about Calvin's death through the small-town grapevine. James looked genuinely sad when I walked into his office, offering his condolences and a cup of coffee I couldn't taste. Now, what can I help you with, Margaret? I explained what Malcolm had told me, watching James's face grow more confused with every word. That doesn't sound right, he said, pulling out a thick file. Calvin and I updated your wills just 2 years ago. Very standard language. Everything to the surviving spouse, then to Malcolm after both of you pass. Hope bloomed in my chest. So Malcolm is wrong? Well, let me check the probate filing. James turned to his computer, his fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a few minutes, his expression changed. This is unusual. What? There's a will filed for probate dated just 6 weeks before Calvin's death. It does leave everything to Malcolm. He looked up at me, his face troubled. But Margaret, I didn't prepare this will. I've never seen this document before in my life. The room spun around me. What does that mean? It means your husband either used another attorney without telling me, or... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Or something isn't right here. Can you get me a copy? I'll have my secretary pull it from the courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. James leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret, do you have somewhere safe to stay while we figure this out? I nodded, though safe felt like a relative term. Nothing felt safe anymore. Not my house, not my son, not even the ground beneath my feet. Walking out of that law office, I felt like I was drowning all over again. But this time, it wasn't grief pulling me under. It was the terrible, growing certainty that my own son had betrayed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on Lorna's lumpy couch, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that looked like a map of some foreign country I'd never visit. My mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. How had 33 years of marriage, of building a life together, come down to nothing? I thought about the girl I'd been when I met Calvin. 19 years old, fresh out of high school, working at the diner on Highway 9 and dreaming of going to college. I'd wanted to be a teacher back then. Had my acceptance letter to Georgia Southern framed on my bedroom wall until the day I moved in with Calvin. "You don't need college," he'd said, pulling me close in that way that made my teenage heart flutter. "I'm going to take care of you forever." And I'd believed him. God help me, I'd believed every word. When Malcolm was born 2 years later, I put those college dreams in a box and focused on being the best wife and mother I could be. While Calvin built his contracting business from nothing, I worked double shifts at the diner to keep food on the table. When baby Malcolm got sick with pneumonia and spent a week in the hospital, I was the one who slept in the uncomfortable chair beside his crib because Calvin had to work. "The business needs me," he'd say whenever I asked for help. "This is all for our family's future." So I sacrificed. I gave up my dreams, my sleep, my own needs, always believing it was temporary. Always believing that once the business took off, once we were more stable, I'd get my turn. That turn never came. By the time Malcolm started school, Calvin's business was thriving. Miller Construction had contracts all over 3 counties. We moved into the farmhouse, and Calvin started talking about expanding, maybe franchising. But whenever I mentioned going back to school, getting my teaching degree, he'd find reasons why it wasn't practical. "Malcolm needs you at home," he'd say. Or, "The business is at a crucial stage right now." Or simply, "We don't have the money for tuition." But we had money for his new truck every 2 years. Money for the base boat he used maybe 6 times. Money for the workshop he built behind the house that was bigger than most people's homes. I pushed those bitter thoughts away and focused on being grateful. We had a beautiful house, a healthy son, and a successful business. Calvin wasn't abusive or unfaithful. He provided for us, came home every night, never missed one of Malcolm's baseball games. By most standards, I had a good life. So, why did I feel like I'd lost myself somewhere along the way? The morning brought James Morrison's phone call with news that made my stomach drop. "I've reviewed the will filed for probate," he said, his voice careful and professional. "Margaret, this is very strange. The document appears to be legitimate, properly notarized, witnessed, signed in Calvin's handwriting. But the language is completely different from anything we ever discussed." "Different how?" "It specifically excludes you from inheriting anything. It states that all marital assets are to go directly to Malcolm, with you receiving what it calls appropriate support for 6 months to help you transition to independent living." The words hit me like physical blows. Appropriate support. Transition to independent living. Like I was some kind of burden Calvin needed to ease his son out of supporting. "James, that doesn't sound like Calvin at all." "No, it doesn't. In all my years representing your husband, he never expressed anything but concern for your financial security. Just last year, he increased his life insurance specifically to make sure you'd be comfortable if something happened to him." "Then, how do you explain this, Will?" There was a long pause. "I can't. But Margaret, I want you to think very carefully about the weeks before Calvin died. Did he seem different? Worried about something? Did anyone new come around the house?" I closed my eyes, trying to remember those final weeks clearly. Calvin had been so weak, so dependent on the morphine for pain management. There were days when he barely knew where he was, much less who was visiting. But Malcolm had been there constantly, taking care of the business decisions Calvin couldn't handle anymore, managing the insurance paperwork, handling all the legal and financial details that I'd never paid attention to because Calvin had always taken care of those things. "Oh my God," I whispered. "What is it?" "Malcolm. He was handling everything those last weeks. Calvin was barely conscious most of the time, and Malcolm said he was taking care of all the business stuff, so I could focus on nursing Calvin." "Did Calvin sign any documents during that time?" I don't know. Malcolm would bring papers for Calvin to sign. Said it was business stuff, keeping the company running while Calvin was sick. Calvin could barely hold a pen, but Malcolm would guide his hand. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "James, Margaret, I think you need to be very careful. If what you're suggesting is true, if Malcolm manipulated your husband into signing a new will while he was incapacitated. That's fraud, isn't it? It's more than fraud. It's elder abuse. It's theft. And if we can prove it, Malcolm could face serious criminal charges. My son, my baby boy who I'd rocked to sleep and bandaged scraped knees and cheered on at every baseball game. The thought of him deliberately deceiving his dying father, of stealing from his own mother, made me physically sick. But it also made me angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. What do I need to do? We need evidence, James said, his voice taking on the sharp focus of a lawyer who'd found his case. Something that proves Calvin's true intentions, or something that shows Malcolm coerced him into signing that will. But how? Malcolm's changed all the locks. I can't even get into my own house. Does he have all of Calvin's belongings? Everything. I thought for a moment, my mind racing through the chaos of the past few days.
Wait.
There are some clothes at Lorna's. Things I grabbed from the hospital when... I couldn't finish the sentence. When Calvin died. Even now, the words stuck in my throat. What kind of clothes? Just everyday stuff. A few shirts, his favorite corduroy jacket. I wanted something that smelled like him. My voice cracked, and I felt foolish admitting it. Margaret, sometimes people hide important documents in unusual places. It's worth checking everything carefully. After hanging up, I stared at the plastic bag sitting in the corner of Lorna's living room. I'd been avoiding it since the day I brought it home from the hospital. The bag contained the last clothes Calvin had worn as a healthy man, the outfit he'd put on for what we didn't know would be his final doctor's appointment. Lorna was at work, so I had the apartment to myself. I carried the bag to the kitchen table and opened it with shaking hands. The smell hit me immediately, Calvin's aftershave mixed with the industrial soap from the hospital laundry. It was so strong, so distinctly him, that I had to sit down and catch my breath. There were 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, and his old corduroy jacket. The jacket was the color of burnt coffee, worn soft from years of trips to the hardware store and Saturday morning projects around the house. Calvin had owned it for at least 15 years, refusing to let me throw it away, even when the elbows wore thin. I held it up to my face, breathing in his scent one more time. Then, steeling myself for the task ahead, I began checking every pocket systematically. The side pockets yielded nothing but lint and an old receipt from the hardware store. The inside breast pocket was empty except for a pen that had leaked blue ink into the fabric. But when I ran my hands along the lining, searching for anything unusual, my fingers found something strange. There was a bump near the bottom hem, something stiff and rectangular hidden in the lining itself. My heart started pounding as I felt around the edges. Someone had cut a small slit in the lining and slipped something inside. The opening was so tiny, so carefully hidden, that you'd never find it unless you were looking for it. I ran to Lorna's sewing box and found a pair of small scissors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip them, but I managed to carefully widen the opening without damaging whatever was inside. An envelope slid out into my palm. It was standard white business size, but yellowed with age and slightly wrinkled from being pressed against Calvin's body for who knows how long. My name was written across the front in Calvin's careful handwriting. For Margaret, if something happens to me. I stared at it for a long moment, afraid to open it. Whatever was inside would either prove Malcolm's innocence or confirm my worst fears about my own son. Either way, my life was about to change again. With trembling fingers, I tore open the envelope. Inside were 3 folded sheets of legal paper. The first was a handwritten will, dated just 2 months before the one Malcolm had submitted to probate. I recognized Calvin's handwriting immediately, the careful script he'd learned in Catholic school, each letter formed with old-fashioned precision. I, Calvin James Miller, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to keep reading. This will was completely different from the one Malcolm claimed was real. In Calvin's true final wishes, everything went to me, the house, the business, the savings accounts, even the life insurance. Malcolm was provided for, but as a secondary beneficiary, inheriting only after my death. but it was the handwritten note attached to the will that made my breath catch in my throat. "Margaret, I pray you never have to read this, but I've been watching Malcolm lately, and I'm worried. He's been asking too many questions about money, about the business, about what will happen when I'm gone. Yesterday, I caught him going through my desk when he thought I was asleep. I love our son, but I don't trust the man he's become. If you're reading this, it means my fears were justified. This is your proof that I never intended to leave you with nothing. You sacrificed everything for our family, and I won't let anyone, not even Malcolm, take away your security. The house is yours. The business is yours. Everything we built together belongs to you. Fight for it, Margaret. Fight for the life you earned. I know you're stronger than you think you are. Love always, Calvin." The papers fluttered to the table as my hands went limp. Calvin had known. In his final months, while I was focused on his medical care, while I was trusting Malcolm to handle the business details, Calvin had seen what I'd missed. Our son was planning to steal everything. But Calvin had been one step ahead. He'd hidden this well where only I would find it, in the coat he knew I'd keep because it smelled like him. He'd protected me even from the grave. I grabbed my phone and called James Morrison. "I found it," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in days. "I found Calvin's real will. Are you certain it's authentic? It's in his handwriting, dated 2 months before the fake one. And James, there's a note. Calvin knew what Malcolm was planning. Bring it to my office immediately. Don't let that document out of your sight." As I carefully folded the papers and slipped them into my purse, I felt something I hadn't felt since Calvin's diagnosis. Hope. My husband hadn't abandoned me. He'd loved me enough to anticipate Malcolm's betrayal and protect me from it. Now it was time to honor Calvin's faith in my strength. It was time to fight. James Morrison's hands trembled as he examined Calvin's handwritten will under his desk lamp. He'd been studying it for 20 minutes, comparing the signature to other documents in Calvin's file, checking dates, reading every word twice. "This is absolutely Calvin's handwriting," he said finally, looking up at me with something like awe. "The paper, the ink, even the way he crosses his T's, it's all consistent with documents I've seen him sign over the years." Relief flooded through me so powerfully, I nearly collapsed in the chair. "So, it's legitimate?" "More than legitimate. It's brilliant." James shook his head in amazement. "Calvin was smarter than I gave him credit for. Look at this." He pointed to the bottom of the will. He had it witnessed by Tom Bradley and Sarah Chen from the hardware store. I called them both this morning. They remember signing it clearly. Calvin told them he was updating his will because of his illness. But what about the will Malcolm submitted? The one that leaves everything to him? James's expression darkened. "That's where things get interesting. I've been doing some digging into the witnesses listed on Malcolm's will. Robert Hayes and Jennifer Walsh, the 2 people who supposedly witnessed Calvin's signature. Robert Hayes moved to Florida 3 years ago and has no record of ever being in Georgia during the time this will was allegedly signed. And Jennifer Walsh?" He paused for dramatic effect. "She's been deceased for 18 months. The room spun around me. Deceased witnesses? Gets worse. The notary listed on the document, Patricia Vance, was arrested 8 months ago for notarizing fraudulent documents. She's currently serving time in state prison. So Malcolm's will is completely fake? Not just fake. Criminally fraudulent. Your son used deceased people as witnesses and a convicted felon as a notary. Either he's incredibly stupid, or he never expected anyone to investigate this closely." I thought about the Malcolm I'd raised, smart, careful, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He's not stupid. He probably figured I'd be too grief-stricken to fight, too intimidated by the legal system to ask questions. Well, he was wrong. James gathered the papers and stood up. "I'm calling the district attorney's office right now. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. It's wire fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Malcolm could be looking at serious prison time." That evening, I sat in Lorna's kitchen, staring at my phone. I'd been trying to work up the courage to call Malcolm for 2 hours. Part of me, the mother part that had kissed scraped knees and cheered at Little League games, wanted to give him one chance to explain, to make this right. When he finally answered, his voice was cautious. What do you want now? I want to know why you did it. Silence stretched between us. I could hear a television in the background, some sitcom laugh track that made this conversation feel even more surreal. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally. I found your father's real will, Malcolm. The one he hid from you. I know about the fake witnesses, the fraudulent notary, all of it. The silence this time was longer, heavier. When Malcolm spoke again, his voice was different. Younger, more vulnerable. Like the little boy who used to confess to breaking lamps or tracking mud through the house. How did you find it? Does it matter? What matters is that your father knew what you were planning. He protected me from you, even from his grave. You don't understand. Malcolm's voice cracked. You don't understand what it was like, watching him waste away, knowing he was going to leave everything to you. I was his wife, Malcolm. We built that life together. You built nothing. The words exploded out of him. You worked at a diner and raised me while he built $1 million business. You think you deserved half of everything he created. The cruelty in his voice hit me like a physical blow. I sacrificed my dreams for this family. I gave up college, my career. Nobody asked you to. Nobody forced you to play the martyr for 30 years. Your father asked me to. He promised to take care of me, and I trusted him. And he did take care of you. For 33 years, you lived in his house, spent his money, never had to worry about anything. But you were never his business partner. You were never his equal. The words were designed to wound, and they did. But underneath the pain, I felt something else rising, a cold, steady anger that had been building for days. You're right, I said quietly. I was never his equal. I was better than that. I was his partner when he had nothing. I was his support when he was building something from scratch. I was his caregiver when he was dying. What were you, Malcolm? Besides a son who could look his dying father in the eye and lie to him. I didn't lie to him. You forged his signature. You used deceased people as witnesses. You had him sign papers while he was barely conscious from morphine. If that's not lying, what is it? Another long silence. When Malcolm spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was scared. Of what? Of having nothing. Of being nobody. Dad built this empire, and I spent my whole life thinking I'd inherit it, thinking I'd finally be important. But then he got sick, and I realized he was going to leave it all to you, and you'd probably sell it or give it away, or mess it up somehow. You don't understand business. You don't understand what it took to build what we have. So, you decided to steal it. I decided to protect it. His voice was stronger now, defensive. I'm his son. I'm the one who should carry on his legacy. His legacy was taking care of the people he loved. You destroyed that the moment you threw me out of my own house. Mom, don't. The word came out sharp and final. Don't call me that. You lost the right to call me that when you left me standing in the rain at my husband's funeral. I hung up the phone and sat in Lorna's quiet kitchen, feeling lighter than I had in months. Tomorrow, the district attorney would file charges. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of reclaiming my life. But tonight, I was finally ready to stop being a victim. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but it felt enormous when I walked through those heavy oak doors 6 weeks later. Malcolm sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, looking pale and hollow-eyed. He'd lost weight since our phone conversation, and his expensive suit hung loose on his frame. He didn't look at me when I entered, but I felt his awareness of my presence like electricity in the air. Judge Patricia Hernandez was a stern woman in her 60s who reminded me of my old high school principal, someone who'd seen every excuse and wouldn't tolerate nonsense. She studied the documents spread before her with the methodical attention of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance of her decisions. This is quite an unusual case, she said, looking over her reading glasses at Malcolm. Mr. Miller, you stand accused of elder abuse, fraud, and forgery in connection with your father's estate. How do you plead? Malcolm's lawyer started to speak, but Malcolm cut him off. Guilty, Your Honor. A murmur ran through the small courtroom. Even his own attorney looked shocked. I felt my breath catch in my throat. After all these weeks of preparation, of building our case, Malcolm was simply giving up. "Mr. Miller, are you certain? This is a felony charge that could result in significant prison time." Malcolm finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger or defiance anymore. It was shame. Pure, devastating shame that seemed to have eaten away at him from the inside. "I'm certain, Your Honor. I did everything they said I did. I betrayed my own mother." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well. Given your guilty plea and cooperation, I'm sentencing you to 2 years in state prison, suspended to 6 months with 5 years probation. You will also forfeit any claim to your father's estate and pay restitution for legal fees and damages." Just like that, it was over. Malcolm would serve his time, and I would go home. But as I watched my son being led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, no victory, just a deep, aching sadness for the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. The keys to my house felt foreign in my hand when James Morrison handed them to me later that afternoon. The same keys I'd used for 30 years, retrieved from Malcolm's belongings after his arrest. It seemed impossible that something so small could represent so much: home, security, identity, power. Lorna drove me back to the farmhouse, chattering nervously about practical things. "We should change all the locks again just to be safe. And you'll want to go through everything, see if Malcolm took anything else." But I wasn't listening. I was staring at my house, sitting on its 15 acres like it had been waiting for me to come home. The white clapboard siding needed a fresh coat of paint, and the garden was overgrown with weeds, but it was still beautiful, still mine. The front door opened easily with my old key. Malcolm had changed the locks to keep me out, but now I was changing them again to reclaim what was mine. Inside, everything looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. This wasn't the house I'd been thrown out of 6 weeks ago. This was the house I'd chosen to fight for, to claim as my own. I spent the first week just walking through the rooms, relearning the space. Calvin's presence was everywhere, his coffee mug still in the sink, his reading glasses on the bedside table, his boots by the back door. But for the first time since his death, those reminders brought comfort instead of pain. He'd protected me. Even knowing he was dying, even suspecting his own son's betrayal, he'd found a way to secure my future. The note he'd left with the will had become my anchor. "Fight for it, Margaret. Fight for the life you earned." By the second week, I was making plans. The house had 6 bedrooms, way too much space for one woman. But it could be something more, something meaningful. I called the local women's shelter and spoke to the director about my idea. "You want to turn part of your home into transitional housing?" she asked, intrigued. "For women starting over after loss or betrayal. Women who need time to find their footing again." That's incredible. There's such a need for something like that. 6 months later, the New Beginnings house opened quietly. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, just 3 women moving into the converted bedrooms upstairs while I kept the main floor for myself. Sarah, escaping an abusive marriage. Linda, whose husband had died suddenly, leaving her with nothing. Maria, thrown out by her own family for refusing an arranged marriage. Women like me. Women who'd lost everything and needed to remember their own strength. I kept Calvin's workshop behind the house, but transformed it into a meeting space where we gathered every evening. Sometimes we talked about practical things, job hunting, budgeting, legal issues. Sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence, drinking tea and watching the sunset through the wide windows Calvin had installed. On quiet nights, I'd walk through the house and listen to the sounds of life resuming, Sarah practicing for her GED test, Linda learning to use a computer, Maria teaching her baby to walk. This house had seen 30 years of one kind of family. Now it was home to a different kind altogether. Malcolm wrote me letters from prison. I read them all, but I didn't answer. He'd apologized, explained, pleaded for forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't something I owed him anymore. It was something I might choose to give someday when I was ready. For now, I had other priorities. Standing on my front porch each morning, coffee in hand, I'd look out at the rolling hills Calvin and I had loved so much. He was gone, But his final gift remained. Not just the house or the land or the financial security, but something far more valuable. He'd given me back my voice, my power, my sense of who I was beyond wife and mother. I was Margaret Miller, and this was my house, my sanctuary, my new beginning. Calvin may have been gone, but he'd left me with the one thing no one could steal, the knowledge that I was strong enough to build whatever life I chose. And I was just getting started.